She was interviewed last week and explained that she'd told her story to Newsnight, but that Newsnight had decided not to run the story.
Welcome to WatchMojoUK, and today we'll be looking at 10 times the BBC was corrupt.
But of course, a lot of people are saying that this is raising questions about the impartiality of the BBC and the way that that process works.
Before we begin, we publish new content every day, so be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos.
For this list, we're looking at the times the Beeb failed to be as neutral as it's supposed to be. Let us know in the comments whether you pay your TV licence. The rumour mill. On more than one occasion, highly successful BBC journalists have been found to be repeating the government's line on various issues. The BBC is, of course, supposed to be non-partisan and reflective of the diverse opinions of the public. In recent years, though, Laura Kuenssberg, former BBC political editor, has parroted government opinions that later turned out to be untrue. She made public tweets talking about information she'd been given from anonymous sources, specifically claiming that the government was going to go against the Supreme Court when it came to Boris Johnson illegally proroguing Parliament in 2019. Apparently, if you say an anonymous Downing Street source told you something, you're beyond reproach. Upper classes. This problem isn't specific to the BBC, it's endemic throughout the entirety of British mainstream media. But since the BBC has a mandate to represent everybody, it's much more obvious. As much as 80% of British journalists belong to the upper classes, privately educated people who can afford to take on unpaid jobs to get ahead.
And even when those from working class backgrounds make it into Britain's top professions, they go on to earn on average 16% less.
This means the BBC is made up predominantly of people who don't represent and may not even understand what the majority of the British public think or how they live their lives. As well as being potentially biased in favour of the rich, it's also been accused of being biased towards London, ignoring the rest of the UK to focus on issues that affect only the capital.
In a lot of elite professions, prejudice about class goes completely unchallenged. Because for all the talk of diversity and inclusion, class is the last barrier.
Naga Munchetty.
And every time I have been told, as a woman of colour, to go home, go back to where I came from, that was embedded in racism.
According to the BBC, seasoned journalist Naga Munchetty calling out offensive comments made by Donald Trump in 2019 constituted breaking their editorial standards. This was despite the fact Trump was the president of the United States of America, a completely different country, and that he was resoundingly unpopular in the UK. Munchetty accused Trump of using racist language, and the BBC upheld a complaint against her, which all became so controversial that Ofcom had to get involved, particularly when Munchetty's white co-host, Dan Walker, who'd agreed with her, was not reprimanded.
I can't see why we still have to treat racism as though it's a legitimate opinion.
In the end, it went all the way to the top, and the Director General had to bin the complaint entirely.
In this instance, I don't think Naga's words were sufficient to merit a partial uphold of the complaint around the comments she made.
Biased science. There's a phenomenon in journalism called false balance, where contentious issues are presented as having equal weight. This is all well and good for some issues, but when it comes to scientific fact, giving equal airtime and attention to science deniers creates the idea that those beliefs are just as valid, even though all the science says they're completely wrong. Investigations found that the BBC was taking impartiality too far, and was trying to be just as impartial on matters of science. This included giving airtime to climate change deniers, despite the fact that polls show that more than 3/4 of the British public are worried about climate change's effects. The BBC had to apologise for this. Anti-Thatcher.
Margaret Thatcher's government cut taxes on the rich and made benefits less generous, as the Conservatives sought to encourage entrepreneurship.
Back in the 1980s, the BBC again appeared to be out of step with the British public. Controversial as Thatcher was, and still is, the fact is that she won numerous elections and was chosen by the public. The BBC was seen to be resoundingly against Thatcher during her tenure, however, to such an extent that the government looked into how biased or unbiased it was being. This included making episodes of Panorama calling Thatcher a militant and coming out deeply critical of the Falklands War even as it was ongoing, according to some pundits at the time. But then the situation was arguably made worse by the Tories sending in the family member of a minister to go and make the BBC more pro-conservative. Scottish referendum. Whose side was the BBC on when it came to the 2014 Scottish independence referendum? Well, according to the SNP, Scottish university researchers, and much of the Scottish public, it was biased in favour of the Unionists.
If Scotland were to leave, just for starters, the UK would literally shrink. It would lose a third of its landmass.
Rather than talk about both sides of the issue of Scottish independence, the BBC was found to give significantly more coverage to the Yes campaign, supporting the people who wanted Scotland to remain a part of the United Kingdom.
Scotland leaving could also affect Britain's standing in the world. Would it still deserve a permanent seat in the UN Security Council?
The BBC denied all these allegations, despite numerical data showing that its coverage of the No campaign was mostly negative.
But why a referendum right now? Because this man, Alex Salmond, promised to hold one if his party was victorious.
In 2014, Scotland voted to stay in the UK with only a narrow margin. Tory Islamophobia.
I think there is still a sense within sections of our party that the British Muslim communities are electorally irrelevant.
Back in 2018, anti-Semitism within the Labour Party was a massive issue, and the BBC, like other news outlets, reported on it heavily. Reports were done and high-profile party members were sacked, including the departure of Jeremy Corbyn. But similar investigations were also being done in tandem. These ones into whether the Conservative Party was institutionally Islamophobic.
Well, the evidence is obvious. You know, we have Bob Blackman, a member of Parliament, who has been retweeting people like Tommy Robinson, the far-right activist.
You'd expect the supposedly non-biased BBC to report on these things equally, since no form of bigotry is more or less important than the other. But research found that the BBC covered Labour's shortcomings an entire 10 times more than they'd covered the Tories.
What concerns me now is not that we still have these issues within our party, but that we are fundamentally now in reverse. We are heading in the wrong direction.
The BBC was accused by British Muslims of creating a hierarchy of racism. Basic economics.
And this is what's happening already. High inflation. Consumer prices rose 5.4% in the 12 months to December last year. That's the highest rate in nearly 30 years.
In 2023, a study into BBC economics found that many BBC journalists apparently lack understanding of basic economics. Researchers said that many of the journalists reporting on economic issues like the government's fiscal policies didn't seem to understand what they were reporting on, which led them to take the government at face value. Sometimes they even looked like they were openly supporting government policy.
But there are other factors too, like tax rises and changes to benefits. All of this is affecting the cost of living.
It boiled down to many reporters assuming that all debt is bad, including government debt, and not criticising the government's spending decisions as being just that, decisions rather than inevitabilities. Boris's loan. Also in 2023, news broke that Boris Johnson had apparently been promised a loan of £800,000 during his time as Prime Minister.
A government investigation will now look into Mr Sharp's part in discussions between multimillionaire Sam Blythe and Boris Johnson.
The person offering to sort out this loan was none other than Richard Sharp, chairman of the BBC, though he's denied all the allegations.
I felt comfortable, and I still feel there was no conflict.
It's thought that the massive loan was to bolster Johnson's income, as the Prime Minister's £164,000 salary is, of course, chump change.
The chairman of the BBC being interviewed by the BBC itself, always a slightly awkward dynamic.
Sharp's hiring by the BBC was put under investigation by the Commissioner for Public Appointments, William Shawcross, who was then forced to leave his own investigation because he too knows Sharp and it would be a conflict of interest. Jimmy Savile.
Today, a week after the story first hit, the BBC Director General George Entwistle apologised to victims of alleged sex abuse by Sir Jimmy Savile and promised to hold an internal inquiry after the police investigation.
For decades, the BBC was responsible for covering up abuse allegations against some of its biggest stars. Almost the face of the BBC for a long time, upon Jimmy Savile's death in 2012, hundreds of historic allegations of abuse were made.
When did public attitudes start to change about Jimmy Savile? You may have said after the ITV documentary last week. You'd be wrong.
But the BBC was slow off the draw reporting the scandal, leaving it up to rival broadcasters to break the news. It then came out that, mere weeks before Savile's death, Newsnight had been running an investigation into him, but it was completely dropped before it could air.
She was interviewed last week and explained that she'd told her story to Newsnight, but that Newsnight had decided not to run the story.
And it wasn't just Savile. There were similar stories about many other major figures at the BBC over the years, going back as far as the 1940s.
Do you agree with our picks? Check out this other recent clip from WatchMojoUK and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.